Joe Bandel's Oak Matrix Anchor 2 claims that chaos is not destruction, but rather the necessary heartbeat of evolution that forces systems to make a quantum leap into higher coherence. We are conditioned to fear instability, yet this framework suggests that holding opposing tensions long enough is the only way a system, whether an atom, a biological cell, or human awareness, can birth a new order.
That framing forces a complete revaluation of how we understand stress and friction. Bandel is pushing back against the deeply entrenched Western paradigm that views duality as a battlefield. We usually think of order and chaos as enemies engaged in a zero-sum war. Bandel treats them as partners in a generative embrace. If you look at the progression he outlines, moving from photon cycles to magnetic vortexes, then to atoms, cells, souls, and finally unified awareness, he's tracking how energy builds up to a breaking point only to reorganize into something more complex rather than simply falling apart.
The phrase he uses is generative friction. He argues there is no war script. That contradicts the second law of thermodynamics, at least in the way it is taught in high school physics, where entropy always increases and the universe is just winding down into a cold, featureless void.
It contradicts the simplified version of the second law, but it actually aligns beautifully with non-equilibrium thermodynamics. In 1977, the Belgian physical chemist Elia Prigogine won the Nobel Prize for his work on dissipative structures. Before Prigogine, physics mostly focused on closed systems near equilibrium where things just wind down and decay. Prigogine studied open systems that are far from equilibrium. He proved that when you pump enough energy into an open system, it becomes highly unstable and chaotic. But at a certain critical threshold, called a bifurcation point, the system does not inevitably collapse. Instead, the chaos acts as a creative force. The system can spontaneously reorganize into a higher, more complex state of order to handle the new energy flow. Prigogine literally called this phenomenon order out of chaos.
That scientific foundation gives Bandel's Anchor 2 a structural backbone. Bandel is taking Prigogine's dissipative structures and extending the principle into metaphysics and consciousness. He describes systems building energy chaotically until that bifurcation point, which he calls a quantum leap to higher stability.
The integration of hard science and philosophy is what makes the Oak Matrix intriguing. Bandel published his theory as a kind of modern mystery school framework, a general unified field theory of breathing truths rather than cold equations. When he says stress held long enough births new order, he is describing a universal pattern. Think of a boiling pot of water. As you add heat, the water molecules move faster and more erratically. The system becomes chaotic. Eventually, the water cannot dissipate the heat through simple conduction anymore. It crosses a threshold and suddenly self-organizes into rolling convection cells. Millions of molecules start moving in a highly coordinated, complex pattern to release the energy. The chaos was the prerequisite for the new structure.
Bandel scales that exact mechanism up the evolutionary ladder. He starts with photon cycles and magnetic vortexes, moving into atoms and cells. Let us trace that path. How does generative friction work at the subatomic or atomic level before it even reaches biology?
At the most fundamental level, you have opposing forces. A photon involves an electric field and a magnetic field interacting. They do not cancel each other out. Their interaction propels the wave forward. Moving up to the atomic level, you have the intense tension between the strong nuclear force binding protons together and the electromagnetic force trying to blow them apart because like charges repel. That tension creates a stable atom. The friction is held in a delicate balance. If you inject massive amounts of energy into that system, like in the heart of a dying star, the chaos increases until the system makes a leap, fusing into heavier, more complex elements. Bandel views this not as blind mechanics, but as an archetype of generative integration.
Then he takes a massive leap from the physical to the metaphysical, linking the cell to the soul, and finally to unified awareness. That is where traditional scientists would argue he crosses the line into quantum mysticism.
He maps a literal physical process onto psychological and spiritual evolution.
The critique of quantum mysticism is valid. Mixing physical chemistry with spiritual development often leads to distorted science. If someone interprets Bandel's digression as empirical proof that a photon has consciousness, they are misreading the framework. But if we treat Anchor 2 as a structural analogy, it becomes a potent psychological tool. The psychiatrist Kazimir Dombrowski developed the theory of positive disintegration, which applies this exact same logic to human psychology. Dombrowski argued that psychological tension, anxiety, and periods of deep internal chaos are not necessarily signs of mental illness. They're often the necessary friction required for a person to break down their current eco-structure and reorganize at a higher, more empathetic, and more stable level of psychological development.
So Dombrowski's positive disintegration is the psychological equivalent of Prigogine's dissipative structures, and Bandel is synthesizing both into a single cosmic rule. The stress is the catalyst. If you try to alleviate the tension too early, you prevent the system from making the leap to higher coherence.
That is the core of the Anchor 2 philosophy. The human instinct is to flee from chaos and resolve tension as quickly as possible. We medicate anxiety, we avoid difficult conversations, and we suppress societal unrest because the friction feels like a threat to survival. Bandel is proposing a paradigm shift. If you view duality as a loving embrace instead of a war, you change your relationship with the stress. You hold the opposition. You allow the chaos to build energy, trusting that the system is preparing for a generative leap rather than impending doom.
The phrase loving embrace feels almost provocative when applied to chaos. We look at a hurricane, which is a classic example of a dissipative structure. A hurricane organizes out of chaotic weather patterns to dissipate the massive heat energy of the ocean. It is highly coherent, yet it brings devastation to whatever it touches. Calling that a loving embrace requires a very detached, cosmic perspective.
That is the paradox of the framework. From the perspective of the ocean and the atmosphere, the hurricane is a magnificent self-organizing solution to a thermodynamic problem. It restores balance. From the perspective of a coastal city, it is pure destruction. Bandel's oak matrix demands that we zoom out. When he speaks of integration and unified awareness, he is asking us to observe the system as a whole. The tension between the hot ocean and the cold atmosphere births the storm. In human terms, the tension between competing political ideologies or cultural values creates intense societal chaos. If we view that chaos through a war script, one side must destroy the other. The system collapses. If we view it through the lens of generative friction, the chaos is the precursor to a societal leap. The opposing forces must be held together until a new, higher-order social structure emerges that integrates the truths of both sides.
That application to society feels urgent. We operate almost entirely on a war script. Every political or cultural conflict is framed as a zero-sum battle where order must crush chaos. Bandel's model suggests that trying to crush the opposing force just stunts the evolution of the system. You have to let the chaos generate the energy required for the leap.
Societal structures are open systems, just like biological organisms or chemical reactions. When a society is rigid and closed off to new information or energy, it stagnates. When new technologies, new ideas, or new economic pressures flood the system, it is pushed far from equilibrium. Institutions fail, norms dissolve. That period feels terrifying because the old order is breaking down. But Prigogine's mathematics and Bandel's philosophy both assert that this instability is a prerequisite for a more complex society. You cannot leap from an agrarian society to an industrial one, or from an industrial society to a digital one without passing through a period of profound destabilization. The friction is generative.
How does a person or a society actively hold that stress long enough to birth the new order? rather than just breaking apart. It seems there must be a limit to how much chaos a system can endure before it simply shatters.
There is a limit. In physics, if the energy flow is too violent and the system cannot self-organize fast enough, it does collapse. The key to Bandel's concept of the embrace is containment. For the generative leap to occur, the opposing forces must be contained within a boundary. In a chemical reaction, it is the beaker. In an atom, it is the nuclear forces. In human psychology, the container is often a person's core values or their sense of purpose. In a society, the container is the rule of law or a shared cultural narrative. The container must be strong enough to hold the friction without breaking, allowing the pressure to build until the components are forced to find a new, more efficient way to relate to each other.
The containment aspect explains why Bandel uses the term matrix. A matrix is a womb, an environment where something can grow. He is suggesting that we must deliberately construct cognitive and social containers capable of holding massive contradictions. We must become comfortable hosting chaos.
Becoming comfortable hosting chaos is the ultimate goal of Anchor 2. It requires abandoning the desire for static perfection. Traditional philosophy often equates perfection with absolute stillness and the absence of conflict. Bandel replaces that static ideal with a dynamic one. Perfection is not the absence of tension. It is the capacity to process tension and continuously evolve. When he maps this onto the soul and unified awareness, he is describing a state of being where a person is no longer threatened by opposing forces. They do not need to fight the chaos because they understand it is the fuel for their own expansion.
That shifts the burden from trying to control the world to expanding one's own capacity to contain the world. If you look at historical examples of profound cultural leaps, the Renaissance or the Enlightenment, they did not emerge from periods of peace. They were born out of plague, war, and religious upheaval. The systems were pushed far from equilibrium.
The Renaissance is the perfect historical parallel. Europe in the 14th and 15th centuries was battered by the Black Death, which wiped out a third of the population. The feudal system collapsed. The absolute authority of the church fractured. It was a period of overwhelming chaos and suffering. Yet that exact destabilization broke the rigid medieval structures. It forced a reorganization of labor, wealth, and thought. The intense friction between old religious dogmas and new scientific observations generated a leap in human culture and intellect. The chaos was the heartbeat of that evolution. The tension birthed a higher coherence.
Bandel's progression ends with unified awareness. If we treat the universe as a fractal system where the rules of the atom apply to the rules of the mind, unified awareness would be the ultimate dissipative structure, a state of consciousness capable of taking in unlimited complexity and holding all opposites without collapsing.
It is the ultimate synthesis, a consciousness that operates without a war script. When you observe a master in any field, a master musician, a master martial artist, or a profound thinker, they do not fight the material. They do not fight the resistance. They absorb the friction and use it to generate flow. Bandel envisions a stage of human development where we apply that mastery to reality itself. We stop fighting the inherent duality of existence and start participating in the generative dance.
The assertion that there is only generative friction leading to integration gives a profound sense of purpose to suffering and disorder. It reframes the most difficult aspects of existence from pointless noise into structural necessities. The Oak Matrix Anchor 2 forces us to reconsider our relationship with instability, urging us to hold the tension just a moment longer to see what new order might emerge.
It is a demanding framework. It asks us to look at the chaos in our own lives and in the world around us and resist the urge to panic. Instead of rushing to impose a superficial, brittle order, we are challenged to trust the deeper mechanics of evolution.
The leap to higher stability requires us to endure the breaking point. If this perspective on chaos and generative tension shifted how you view the friction in your own life, send this episode to someone who might need a new way to understand their own challenges.